I'm James. I was a security engineer for a bunch of different companies, whether MDR or SaaS, most recently at PagerDuty, which is FedRAMP Low, which was its own nightmare in and of itself. And so use that experience to create Latio Tech, which is meant to be a way for engineers to find hands-on content about what security vendors to look for, how tools actually work, and some of the developments that they should be looking at for their own cloud and application security programs. So,
great. And Nir?
One of the founders of Arnica and CEO, but for the purpose of the conversation today, I am the AppSec guy. Historically, I was a VP security in a company called Finastra, large fintech, beforehand CISO in a company called Cabbage. And I was the first head of AppSec for NCR, the National Cash Register. Contributed to some open source projects, still writing or trying to write some code, but mainly for my own demos these days.
Great. And I love that you're putting on different hats for us today, because here's what we're going to cover. So in this webinar, we've done our introductions. We're going to discuss some of the AppSec challenges that I'm sure some people on this call have experienced or maybe are looking to solve. And then we're going to talk about what we even mean when we say developer native. I'm sure if you join this call, you're actively asking, what does that mean? Or maybe you'd like to hear our perspective about it. And then we'll go into a practical application about what that looks like using a couple of workflows. And then we'll take your audience questions. So if you brought a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can ask it at the end of this call. I will be moderating this discussion. My name is Anna. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Arnica. And we'll take your questions. So we're going to get started with a big question here. And Nir, this is going to require you to put on your AppSec hat for sure. What are the cultural challenges that are impacting AppSec and development teams? Let's have a discussion. What are these cultural challenges?
Do you want to start, James?
Sure. I think the core issue is that as much as there have been so many different attempts to unite the goals of these two teams, that first of all, there's not like a standard, here's the good way to do it. There's like good ideas out there. I remember trying to implement my first like DevSecOps program, which tries to address the friction that often happens between AppSec and dev teams. I was reading posts about like security champions and reading like Spotify's blog about how they organize their engineering teams, and looking at like Netflix and Meta and like a lot of these bigger companies that were and are still providing guidance is very specific to their kinds of organizations, which are very large distributed development teams on heavily cutting edge sort of microservice architectures where they have enough development power to really commit someone in a security champion kind of capacity and build that sort of large scale program. And where I ran into the cultural challenges was when you try to apply that to a smaller organization or an organization that's not even primarily developer focused. It becomes a lot harder where both the dev expertise is just that they have a lot to learn on the security front, and the security team is usually not at a lot of these big companies. The AppSec team is primarily developers, and so they are very in close with the code. But for a lot of organizations, like the security team are people like me who came up through infrastructure and are sort of learning code as they were going. And that creates, I think, a big mismanaged set of expectations where the security team has this expectation that they can sort of, okay, I bought my scanner tool and now it's going to show me all my scan results and I'll send those over to development and like they'll get fixed. And then they sort of have to learn the hard way through dev frustration what this really means trying to create an AppSec program. And so fundamentally, I think it's the learning process for real organizations, I'll say, that aren't like FANG or whatever the new acronym is for that. The cultural challenge is, how do you implement this? How do you have a team that's usually not developers implement a security program for developers whose main goal is not security.
I can very much relate to this. I could see this from an additional angle, not necessarily different, but one of the things that, as you mentioned, you get the scanner, right? You get the scanner, you have a bunch of results. In many cases, it can be a PDF or whatever way that you communicate to developers, and you hand it out to them. They have no idea what to do with it. And on one hand, in many cases, they're not measured on it. But on the other hand, they still have certain mandates that they need to meet. Sometimes it's the security team that is strong enough. Sometimes it's compliance. Sometimes you work for a fintech, insurtech, or you need PCI, whatever, right? And that is something that comes to you from the top. And you have no choice but to adhere to this. But then you look at this, PDF report, and you don't know what should you do next. You have, 500 issues. 100 of them are high, and then okay, where do I fix them? Right. So there's a huge disconnect between the term of a vulnerability or a risk versus where do I need to fix it in the code and what exactly do I need to do. Yep. Right. So the challenge is in the language. The challenge is the motives that engineering teams have, because let's compare it to quality as well. By the way, if you look at releasing software with low quality, the developers know that it will impact them. It's not a matter of when, right? Or if. You can see that pretty much immediately, unless it's a prototype, right? If you wanted to build an enterprise software, you kind of need to QA this. You kind of need to have some automated tests. But in security, it's not a must in most cases, and they don't treat it the same way. You will see many companies with certain status checks running, checking for code coverage and test coverage, but not as much companies looking for security coverage. And this is the disconnect because of the lack of measurement for developers to write secure code.
Well, and I think the developers definitely get super jaded because of the nature of security tooling too, where the tests were written usually by the internal development team for their own code. And so it's like tailored to their environment out of the box. But when you just plug in a SAS scanner or an SEA scanner, that thing's just like gonna let loose with almost no true positives. Like it's gonna feel that way because the number of true positives is like so small compared to the false positives. And so developers, I think, just immediately get trained. They'll tend to like most of the time, the relationship starts in really good faith, where a developer wants to, if security is saying, hey, we've got these 5 critical issues, like we're a huge risk, like a developer's concerned about that and they're going to do it. But then they start digging into it and they're like, oh, this is all like, this is just wrong. This one's wrong. This one's wrong. And then it just becomes like the boy who cried wolf, and it's just constant noise. And that's where it almost, but the problem with that is it creates an anti-pattern, I would argue, where security then tries to play this like validation catch-up game, where their reaction to that is, I need to validate these more before I send them to developers. And then we're not really doing this shift left thing that we started out trying to do, because once again, the security team's the bottleneck on getting the vulns to the developers, because they're trying to manually validate to a high degree of confidence every single finding that they had when they plugged in the scanner.
Correct. And it actually creates a bigger challenge because so if you think about the involvement of AI these days, I know we need to push this word some here, but in essence, developers do get the productivity gains. They can write more code, they can do vibe coding. It produces a lot of code. And let's assume that vibe coding is a temporary thing to do prototyping, but maybe one day it will be, production code. Okay, and still, with more of that code, you will likely have way more results. It can be way more SCA results, can be way more SAST results, because again, the code by default is not secure, right? And you need to prompt it in a specific way to be secure. And then you look at the security team, and they're way more overwhelmed with those issues that they will get, and try to triage them for the engineers, right? Because you mentioned, James, that the security teams may want to help with triaging before it goes to the developers. And that creates a no-win situation for the security team that cannot really get this productivity gain, right? So I'd say that it's not necessarily a cultural challenge, but it's definitely something that trends up, where security teams are also trying to figure out how can they be more effective with their time and their resources to help the developers without pissing them off, right?
Well, that's, I think, outside of the tools, even the most important change that I would suggest people make is doing like remediation first thinking, where you're not looking at a large list of SAST results and then trying to discern like what's the priority here. You're more thinking, how do we want to fix SQL injections? How do we want to fix buffer overflows? How do we, I mean, that's the way that Google started their transition to Rust, was in order to address in part buffer overflow. And like, as security team, if your approach is like, we put a scanner in, there's a million buffer overflow results, I better send these to developers like as fast as possible, you'll miss those bigger architectural discussions that are actually what needs to happen, which is like, would it be faster or better, or the development team already wants to implement this thing, but it hasn't been a priority, or they haven't had time. They want to make a validator or a sanitizer for people to use for SQL injection, for whatever. And that's where that higher level thinking, both on SaaS, but also for like SCA and container vulns, where it's more about how do we want to build a patching program for our services to create more ephemeral service architectures. That's more the question to me than any individual CVE associated to a specific package.
Side note, by the way, interesting thing that we can see trending up across customers and deployments is that more and more companies are using internal packages that they create for the rest of the team. So in microservice architecture, for example, where you want to have certain dependencies, you don't need to pull them from an external source. You typically need to pull them from an internal. But then the question that pops up every single time is, how do I make sure that the package that a service uses is the right version of the internal package? And you always, it's like, yeah, in SCA, you need to make sure that you have the right third-party packages. But what about the first-party packages that have other third-party transitive packages? And how do you make sure that they actually upgrade those packages? It's also a challenge. However, I do think that it creates kind of less challenges for security if you have everything boxed in such a way. But still, if you wanted to notify the developers about a fix, you need to know exactly who you need to notify. You need to notify the internal team, or you need to notify the developer that needs to upgrade to a newer internal package.
Well, that's especially prevalent in Java. And I think part of the challenge we have is that language thing, where it's like, it's a commonality to Java, but if you're a security engineer just getting into development, you're not going to know to look for it until it's already this giant pain. Where like you've had to try to figure out, okay, where'd this vulnerability come from? Oh, it's from this, and you're like manually figuring it all out. And then to the point around like the role of scanners and all of this, like for so long, Renovate was the only solution that was even like attempting to help. Like this is not an endorsement of Renovate as like an amazing experience, but it was literally I was early in the buying process for some of these tools, and I was asking all of them, like, is there a way that you can help with like identifying if the root cause is an internal dependency? And the answer was always, like, well, later we'll figure it out. And it's still a case that I just don't see many solutions for.